Welcome back to a journey designed for rest, a tranquil exploration of the past, focusing not on the grand battles and the imperial decrees, but on the mundane, the repetitive, and the quietly constant. Tonight, we invite you to settle in and let your mind drift through the smoke and scents of an ancient Roman kitchen. Imagine, if you will, the city of Rome, not at the bustling forum's peak, but in the pre-dawn quiet. The air is still cool, carrying the faint, earthy scent of wood smoke already beginning to rise from the tabernae and the insulae. Our focus is the slow, deliberate process of cooking and meal preparation, a daily ritual that bound every Roman, from the lowliest slave to the most powerful senator. It is in the preparation of food that we find the true rhythm of Roman life, a rhythm we hope will gently lull you into a deep and restorative sleep. The Roman kitchen, or cucina, was rarely the bright, airy, and centrally located heart of the home that we know today. For the vast majority of citizens living in the multi-story apartment buildings, the insulae, a proper kitchen might not have existed at all. Instead, they relied heavily on street vendors and the Roman equivalent of fast food joints, the thermopolia. Think of the thermopolium as a simple counter-service establishment, often featuring a large masonry counter with sunken pots, dolia, holding hot food and drinks. The sounds here would be muted, the steam rising softly into the narrow streets. This reliance on prepared food was a necessity born of space and safety concerns. Open fires were a constant threat in the densely packed, largely wooden insulae. However, for the wealthy elite, the domus possessed a dedicated cucina. These were usually small, dark, and often positioned in a remote corner of the house, near the latrine, to keep the smoke and odors away from the main living areas and the reception rooms. It was seen as a service area, not a social space. And within this dim, smoky room, the entire universe of Roman gastronomy was created. The center of the Roman culinary world. The hearth. The undisputed focal point of the Roman kitchen was the hearth, or focus. Unlike modern ranges, the Roman hearth was essentially a low, raised platform built of brick or stone. There were no closed ovens or regulated burners. Everything was cooked over in or near an open fire. This is where the true art and patience of Roman cooking lay. The cooks, almost always slaves for the wealthy or the matrona, the mistress of the house, herself in more modest homes, had to be masters of heat management. They were not simply controlling a dial. They were controlling embers, flame, and ash. Consider the slow, steady burn required for a long-simmered stew. Wood, primarily oak or olive wood, was burned down to coals, and the cooking vessel was placed directly on a tripod, tripos, over the embers. For quick frying or boiling, the vessel might be suspended slightly higher, or the fire fanned gently to produce a higher flame. The technique was intuitive and learned, passed down through practice. For baking, the process was even more complex. The hearth often incorporated a primitive oven, fornax, which was a small domed chamber, also made of masonry. To use it, the cook would first build a fire inside the chamber itself. Once the walls were thoroughly heated, a process that could take hours, the ashes and embers were scraped out. The bread, pastry, or dish to be baked was then placed inside, relying on the residual heat stored in the stone walls. This method demanded precise timing and an experienced hand to judge the temperature by feel and sight alone. The intense, radiating heat, once the door was sealed, would slowly and evenly cook the food. Essential utensils, the tools of the trade. The tools used in this environment were sturdy, functional, and predominantly made of two materials, earthenware and bronze. Earthenware. The most common cooking vessel was the olla, a deep, round-bottomed clay pot. The round bottom was crucial. It allowed the pot to sit securely within a tripod or directly amongst the glowing coals, distributing the heat evenly. These pots were essential for boiling water, simmering pulse, a thick porridge that was the staple food of the early Romans, and preparing stews. They were cheap, easy to replace, and an indispensable part of every Roman's culinary kit. Another common vessel was the patella, a broad, shallow pan, often made of terracotta or bronze, used for frying, baking small cakes, or serving certain dishes. The patella is where many of the iconic Roman egg-based or savory sweet dishes, like the famous patina apiciana, would have been cooked. Bronze and iron. For the wealthier households, bronze cooking utensils were the norm. Bronze was more durable, heated more quickly, and often beautifully crafted. Pans, sartago, made of bronze or sometimes iron, were used for frying and sautéing. These often had long handles, allowing the cook to stand back from the intense heat of the open fire. Ladles, trulla or kyathus, flesh hooks for lifting meat from the pot, and skimmers were also typically cast in bronze. These items were significant investments, often detailed with small decorative elements, hinting at the owner's status. The most distinctive Roman utensil, perhaps, was the mortarium, or mortar and pestle. While not a cooking vessel in the strictest sense, it was absolutely fundamental to the Roman culinary process. Roman cuisine relied heavily on sauces, spices, and complex mixtures. Think of the ubiquitous fish sauce, garum, or the highly seasoned martyrdom, a kind of herbed cheese spread. All of these required grinding and pounding. The mortarium was a deep, sturdy earthenware bowl with a rough, often grooved interior surface, perfect for crushing herbs, nuts, and dried spices into the fine consistency required for Roman recipes. The rhythmic sound of the pestle hitting the mortarium would have been a constant, soothing sound in the Roman culina. Let us pause here, allowing the faint aroma of wood smoke and crushed herbs to settle. We've established the setting, the dark, hot culina, the demanding hearth, and the robust tools of the trade. The initial stage, preparation. As the fire in the focus begins its slow, steady heat generation, the cook turns their attention to the raw materials. The preparation stage in the Roman kitchen was labor-intensive and essential for a cuisine that highly prized pulverized textures, strong flavors, and dishes that defied the simple roasting of meat. This stage relied on a few simple, yet constantly used instruments. The ubiquitous tool here was the knife, coulter. Roman knives were typically made of iron, sometimes with bone or wood handles. They were generally straight-bladed and designed for all-purpose work, slicing, chopping, and mincing. Unlike today's specialized sets, the Roman kitchen often relied on a single, well-maintained blade for nearly every task, from trimming vegetables to jointing poultry. The sound of the knife rhythmically hitting the wooden cutting surface, if a dedicated board was used, which was not always the case, sometimes the edge of a counter or a platter sufficed, would have been another constant, comforting pulse of the domestic sphere. The importance of mincing and pounding cannot be overstated. Roman recipes, as documented by the famous cookery book attributed to Apicius de Re Coquinaria on the subject of cooking, frequently instruct the cook to pulverize ingredients. This was partly due to the texture preference of the time, and partly a necessity. It was an effective way to tenderize tough cuts of meat, or incorporate strong flavors evenly into a sauce. The food was often meant to be soft, spoonable, and heavily flavored, masking any potential deficiencies in the quality of the ingredients. This is where the mortarium reemerges as the star. Imagine the cook standing patiently, the heavy stone pestle in hand. They might be grinding pepper, an incredibly expensive imported spice, or perhaps liquamen, the pure version of fish sauce, with herbs like rue, lovage, and dill. The process is not quick. It requires steady, repetitive force, a task often assigned to a strong junior slave or a member of the household accustomed to monotonous labor. The grinding motion is slow, the focus intense, until the mixture achieves the consistency of a fine paste, ready to be dissolved into a liquid base or rubbed onto meat before it touches the heat. The role of olive oil and garum. Two ingredients dominate the list of Roman preparations, acting as the foundation for almost every dish: olive oil and garum. Olive oil, oleum. Olive oil was the lifeblood of the Roman diet. It was used not just for cooking, but also as a dressing, a condiment, and even as a source of light, burned in lamps. The quality varied drastically. The finest first press oil was reserved for the table, used much like a dipping sauce. Cheaper, lower grade oil, often thicker and more pungent, was used extensively in the cooking process, for frying, braising, and as a base for stews. Storing the oil was crucial. It was kept in large ceramic storage jars called amphorae, often partially buried in the cool floor of a storeroom to maintain a consistent temperature. The glug-glug sound of oil being poured from a smaller, narrow-necked ampulla, flask, into a heating pan is a sound that defines the Roman culina. Garum, fish sauce. Perhaps the most distinctive and pervasive Roman ingredient was garum. This fermented fish sauce, made from the guts and small fish, like anchovies, left to cure in salt under the sun for months, provided the umami that Romans craved. It was used in almost everything, from savory dishes to sweet desserts. Think of it as the Roman equivalent of salt, but with a powerful, complex flavor profile. For the cook, garum was more than a seasoning. It was a flavor amplifier and a source of salt. It came in various grades, from the highest quality, clear and pale liquamen, to the thick, gritty dregs called alec. The smell of a Roman kitchen, particularly in the morning, would have been a complex blend of wood smoke, strong herbs, and the distinctive, pungent aroma of this fermented sauce, perhaps mingled with the sweetness of honey. Preservation techniques. Planning ahead, because there was no refrigeration. Roman cooks and households spent a significant amount of time on food preservation. Preparing meals often involved working with ingredients that had already been dried, salted, or preserved in brine or oil. Salting and smoking. Meats, particularly pork and fish, were heavily salted, a process that draws out moisture and inhibits bacterial growth. Hams and bacon were commonplace and would have hung from the rafters in cooler parts of the house or storage area, waiting to be sliced and cooked. The salty, savory punch of preserved meat was a key flavor component. Drying. Fruits, like figs and dates, vegetables and herbs were frequently dried, allowing them to be stored for the winter. The kitchen would often be near a warm, dry area, or things would be hung outside in the sun. Imagine the sight: strings of dried onions, garlic, and bunches of herbs hanging like edible curtains, ready to be rehydrated and incorporated into a sauce or stew. Pickling in brine. Vegetables were often kept in brine or vinegar, stored in small dolia. Olives, for instance, were cured in brine or packed in oil. This forward-looking preparation ensured a steady supply of staples, reducing the daily burden of sourcing fresh ingredients and illustrating the long-term cyclical nature of Roman cooking. The sounds of scooping brined goods out of a large jar, the gentle splash of the liquid, would accompany the cook's methodical work. We have now established the preparatory tasks, moving from the silent, powerful mortarium to the briny depths of the preservation jars. The cook is ready. The ingredients are prepped. The daily grind, processing grains. While the wealthy consumed a varied diet, the cornerstone of the Roman working-class diet, and indeed the historical basis of Roman nutrition, was grain, specifically wheat and barley. The preparation of grain was perhaps the most monotonous and time-consuming part of the daily routine, a task that began long before the hearth was lit. Before it could be cooked, the grain often had to be ground. Although large cities like Rome had public bakeries, pistrina, equipped with large donkey or slave-powered rotary mills, mola asinaria, smaller households still relied on the humble quern, mola manualis, a simple hand mill. Imagine the low, repetitive scraping sound of the stone turning upon stone. This sound was the soundtrack to countless Roman mornings. The operator, often bending low, would pour the grain into the hole in the top stone, the catillus, and turn the upper stone, the matta, against the lower one, slowly crushing the kernels into flour or a coarse meal. This task was physically demanding and required steady, unhurried effort. The fine dust of the flour would settle gently on the surfaces of the culina. The staple, pulse, the Roman porridge. The resulting coarse grain, or far, was most often used to create pulse, a thick, savory porridge. Pulse was the fundamental dish of early Rome and remained a key foodstuff for the poor and soldiers throughout the empire. It was the original comfort food of the Romans. Preparing pulse was a simple but slow process. The grain was placed in the olla, the deep clay pot, with water or milk, and it was set over the low, steady heat of the embers. Like any slow-cooked porridge, it demanded constant, gentle stirring to prevent sticking and burning. The cook would use a simple wooden spoon or paddle, patiently and rhythmically tracing the bottom of the pot. The soft bubbling of the porridge, the occasional scrape of the spoon against the earthenware, and the gentle rising steam were the only sounds accompanying the cook's focused labor. Pulse was a blank canvas. It could be enriched with various additions: vegetables like lentils and beans, legumina, herbs like fennel and mint, and often a dash of garum for saltiness. For those who could afford it, chunks of preserved meat or cheese were stirred in, transforming the humble porridge into a hearty meal. The essence of the dish was its sustained, slow cooking, a process that perfectly aligns with our goal of tranquility. Boiling, braising, and broiling. While the pulse simmered, other dishes would be prepared using the variety of heat zones available on the Roman hearth. The ability to manage heat precisely, using different elevations and distances from the fire, allowed for multiple cooking methods simultaneously. boiling, coquer. This was the simplest method, essential for vegetables, beans, and creating liquid bases for sauces. The olla full of water would be placed directly over the hottest part of the fire, perhaps elevated slightly on a metal tripod to catch the higher flame. The sound of the water rapidly heating, the hiss and bubble of the vigorous boil, was a temporary sharp noise in the usually quiet kitchen. Braising and stewing. Many dishes, like the highly flavored meat stews, minotaur, required long, slow braising. These vessels were placed further from the main flame, on a bed of smoldering embers beneath the hearth. The heat here was consistent but low, allowing the flavors of the meat, vegetables, and wine-based sauces to meld over hours. The gentle plop and slosh of the thick stew would be barely audible, a soft, sustained noise promising a deeply flavored meal. Broiling and grilling. For cuts of fresh or preserved meat, broiling was often used. The cook would use a simple gridiron, varius criticula, a metal grate, placed over a clean, smokeless bed of glowing charcoal. The direct, intense heat would cook the meat quickly, searing the outside. The sizzle and fat drip onto the hot coals, producing a brief puff of flavorful smoke, was the sign that the meat was ready. Because this method could easily char the food, it required the cook's full, undivided attention, constantly turning the pieces with the bronze flesh hook. As the sun climbs higher outside, the Roman kitchen moves from the slow work of grinding and stirring to the active management of multiple cooking vessels. The air is thick with the competing aromas of savory stew, sweet boiling herbs, and the faint, dusty scent of fresh flour, the culinary signature, the dance of sweet and savory. The flavor of Roman cuisine cannot be defined by a single note. Rather, it is a complex symphony where sweet, sour, and savory elements are skillfully combined. This is a deep, layered palate that can sometimes be surprising to modern tastes accustomed only to salt and simple herbs. The creation of these flavor layers constitutes the final, most delicate stage of the cooking process. As the cooking nears completion, the cook's full attention turns to the condimenta, the sauces. The soul of a Roman dish often resides in its sauce. Wine and vinegar in the cooking process, vinum et acetum. Wine, or vinum, was not just a drink for the Romans. It was a vital cooking tool. Cheap, slightly sour wine or vinegar, acidum, was used to introduce an acidic tang to the meal. In a wide, shallow bronze pan, the cook gently places a measure of wine close to the heat. The goal is not to bring it to a rapid boil, but rather to slowly reduce it, concentrating its essence. The wine in the pan simmers quietly, forming tiny, delicate bubbles on its surface, rather than a vigorous froth. The sound of this evaporation is not the roar of a waterfall, but the gentle flow of a river, soft and consistent. As the wine reduces, its sweetness intensifies, and the remaining acidity is prepared to perfectly counterbalance the richness of meat stock or the saltiness of garum. The intense acidic vapor that rises during this process forms the final, strong olfactory layer of the kitchen air. Sweet touches. Honey and dates mel at dactyly. Adding sweetness to a savory dish is key to the Roman flavor balance. As the sauce takes its final form, the cook uses natural sweeteners such as honey, mel, or crushed dates, dactyly. The thick, golden honey is slowly drizzled into the warm sauce with a bronze ladle. The ladle makes a soft clink against the rim of the pot. The flow of the honey is viscous, immediately thinning out as it mixes into the hot liquid. This mixing process is also unhurried. It requires smooth, circular movements to ensure the honey is fully dissolved. This is a calm, sustained sound of yielding liquid audible among the other kitchen noises. Alongside this sweetness, sometimes exotic spices, such as piper or zingiber, are introduced. The spices might be freshly ground again in the mortarium, then gently scattered onto the surface of the sauce, sometimes first suspended in the honey. The warm aroma of the spreading spice, as it slowly diffuses, represents the current moment of refinement. The final action, binding and thickening. Once the sauce achieves the correct flavor balance, the cook's final task is to bind it and bring it to the desired consistency. While modern kitchens rely on flour or cornstarch, Romans often used pulverized cooked egg yolks or starchy flour, amulum. These ingredients are gradually stirred into the hot sauce, and once again, a calm and continuous whisking action begins. The cook uses a wooden implement rather than a metal whisk, checking the sides and bottom of the pan to prevent lumps. The consistency of the sauce changes slowly, almost magically, and the soft whoosh sound of the stirrer in the liquid becomes the final rhythmic melody of the kitchen. The texture thickens, catching the light, and now it is ready. Transition to silence. The dishes are now finished. The pulse has been left to cool by the edges of the pot. The sauces have reached their final density, and the meats have been set aside to rest. After the intense work, the cook gently places the implements down on the countertop. The soft tap of the wooden spoon against the marble. The gentle splash of the bronze ladle dropping into a water-filled basin for cleaning. These are the quiet signals that the work is complete. The fire in the hearth is now slowly dying down, leaving behind only a deep crimson glow. The pervasive smoke has dissipated, leaving only the deep, layered scent of the finished meals. The kitchen, after all that vigorous activity, now settles into a profound silence. The warm heart of the fornax. While most daily cooking relied on the direct flame of the focus, some dishes, most notably the various types of bread and specialty pastries, required the indirect, enveloping heat of the oven or fornax. This was a more specialized endeavor, often reserved for larger households or professional bakers. But even the smallest domestic kitchen might have a rudimentary version built into the masonry of the hearth structure. The preparation of the fornax was a process of patient, slow anticipation. First, a fire was built inside the oven chamber itself. Wood or kindling was allowed to burn vigorously for hours, heating the thick, insulating stone walls. This stage was loud and smoky, but it was followed by a profound silence, the silence of waiting. Once the cook judged the stone to be sufficiently hot, a slave or assistant would perform the careful, essential task of cleaning the chamber. Using a long-handled scraper and brush, they would meticulously rake out every last piece of glowing charcoal and ash. This sound is a dry, rhythmic scrape of metal against hot stone, a final, intense burst of friction before the baking silence. The quiet act of baking. With the oven clean, the real work begins. The prepared dough, perhaps a simple panis quadratus, a standard loaf pre-scored into 4 portions, is gently slid into the cavern of the oven using a long wooden peel, pala. The air inside is still, dry, and intensely hot. The heavy door is sealed, and the cook steps back. This is the longest, quietest period in the Roman kitchen's daily cycle. There is no bubbling, no stirring, and no sizzling. There is only the hush of transformation. The energy stored in the stone walls slowly radiates, causing the dough to rise and the surface to turn golden brown. For an hour or more, the cook listens only for the subtle signs of doneness, the changing scent, the soft whiffs of yeasty, caramelized crust that might escape the tightly sealed door. Finally, the door is opened, and the peel is used to retrieve the bread. Tapping the bottom of the finished loaf with a knuckle produces a satisfying, deep, hollow thud, the signal that the bread is baked through and ready to be placed on a cooling rack, perhaps woven from reeds, where it can make soft, creaking noises as it settles and releases steam. The smell of this fresh-baked bread, a comforting, rich aroma, momentarily dominates the air, a scent of basic sustenance and domestic peace. The aggressive sizzle, deep frying, frittura. On the opposite end of the heat spectrum from the quiet oven was frittura, or deep frying, a technique used for certain snacks, fritters, and small fish. This method required intense, rapid heat and large amounts of oil. The cook would pour a generous amount of oil into a deep, wide bronze pan, sartago, and place it directly over the hottest part of the hearth. They would wait, patiently, for the oil to reach the exact point of near smoking. The moment the food, perhaps small cakes or strips of savory dough, is dropped into the hot oil, there is a sharp, brief, and aggressive sizzle and spatter. This loud initial reaction quickly settles into a soft, steady, sustained bubbling and hissing, the sound of liquid fat actively cooking the food. The cook must be attentive, using a long-handled bronze skimmer to gently turn the items, ensuring they brown evenly. The smell here is sharp and rich, the potent aroma of hot oil mingled with the quick cooking ingredients. It is a fast, high-energy cooking moment that stands in contrast to the slow simmer of the stews. Yet both are essential parts of the Roman culinary repertoire. The simple sweet finale. Secondae mensae. The preparation of secondae mensae, the equivalent of dessert, often brought a quiet, meticulous focus back to the kitchen after the intensity of the main meal's preparation. Roman desserts were generally simple, relying on fresh or dried fruits, nuts, and honey. The cook might be engaged in the quiet act of slicing figs, arranging walnuts and almonds, or preparing a simple honey cake. These tasks require patience and precision, not heat. Imagine the soft, dull sound of a fig being halved on a wooden board, the gentle clatter of nuts being poured from a jar, or the slow, even drizzle of cool honey being poured from a spout onto a platter of fresh cheese. The preparation of dessert is an act of garnish and arrangement, a quiet, meditative process that ensures the final presentation is as pleasing as the robust meal that preceded it. The imperative of storage. In the absence of any form of mechanical refrigeration, the handling and storage of any surplus food was a critical and time-sensitive task. Waste was not an option. Therefore, Roman cooks and housekeepers had to employ clever methods to keep leftovers safe until the next meal. This required a quick transition from the active heat of cooking to the cool, still environment of the storeroom or cella. Leftover stews, meats, and sauces were transferred immediately into smaller, narrow-necked earthenware jars or pots. The enemy was air and bacteria. To prevent spoilage, Surfaces might be entirely covered in a layer of oil or vinegar, creating a seal. Then, the ceramic lid would be firmly pressed down. The sound of a thick, heavy ceramic lid being seated onto a jar, resulting in a soft, muffled thud or clunk, was the sound of successful preservation. These sealed jars were then carried to the coolest part of the house, perhaps a basement area or a corner of the storage room where the floor was packed earth, which retained the earth's natural coolness. Imagine the slow, shuffling sound of sandals on the stone floor, carrying the day's leftovers into the comforting darkness. In the cella, the only sounds are the dull, cool echoes and the occasional, almost imperceptible creak of a storage amphora under its own weight. The great scourging, cleaning the colina. Once the food was safely stored, the most laborious part of the post-meal process began, the cleanup. The Roman kitchen, with its open fire, oil-based cooking, and lack of running water, was a constant battle against grease, soot, and ash. The cleaning process was relentless and physical. Water had to be carried in from an outside well or public fountain, often in heavy ceramic jugs, hydria. The sound of the water being sloshed and poured into various basins and scrubbing tubs was a noisy, repetitive component of the cleanup. The utensils demanded special care. The valuable bronze pans and tools could not simply be wiped clean. They required scouring with abrasive materials, typically fine sand, wood ash, which acted as an alkaline soap or lye, or specialized abrasive stones. The sound is a wet, grainy, back-and-forth friction, the persistent SRR, SRR, SRR of the scrubber against the bronze. This rhythmic sound was the soundtrack of diligence, ensuring the metal was polished back to a dull gleam, free of verdigris or built-up grease, ready for the next day. Earthenware ollae and mortaria were scrubbed with rough hemp or bristle brushes. The rough interior of the mortarium required particularly vigorous attention to ensure all traces of strong spices or fish sauce were removed. The dull, scraping sound of the brush against the porous terracotta surface added to the chorus of cleaning noises. Finally, the hearth itself had to be tended. Ash had to be carefully separated from reusable charcoal and banked for the next morning's fire. The sound of the metal shovel scraping the cold ash on the masonry floor is dry and sharp, a final definitive sound that marks the end of the day's heat, the quiet authority of the kokus. This entire culinary operation, from the initial pounding in the mortarium to the final scouring of the pots, was overseen by the kokus, the cook. In wealthy households, the kokus was a highly valued, skilled slave, often imported and commanding a significant price. Their position was one of quiet, focused authority. They were not merely laborers, they were artists, chemists, and managers. They had to understand the seasonality of food, the complex requirements of Roman flavor profiles, and the meticulous process of preservation. The cook, having directed the day's labor, now stands back, surveying the clean, dark kitchen. Their movements are measured and efficient, a quiet demonstration of their skill. As the last pots are hung on their hooks and the final bucket of soiled water is carried out, the kulina returns to its pre-dawn state. The stone floor is swept, the remaining heat is minimal, and the lingering scents are now only the faint, clean scent of water and ash overlaid by the deep, residual odor of herbs and oil. The kitchen is silent, waiting for the sun to rise and the cycle to begin anew. The market at dawn, The supply chain begins before the city of Rome awoke to the day's clamor. The preparation for the wealthy kitchen began not by the hearth, but at the markets, the macellum, or specialized forums like the forum alatorium, the vegetable market. This task of sourcing ingredients was typically carried out by a trusted slave or the housekeeper, seeking the freshest, best-priced goods. Imagine the pre-dawn quiet of the marketplace. The vendors are setting up, carefully arranging their wares on woven mats and wooden stalls. The sounds here are muted. The soft rustle of straw and dried leaves, the dull thud of a basket being set down, and the low murmur of negotiation between the supplier and the buyer's agent. There is no urgency in the sounds, only the slow, methodical business of selecting quality produce. The buyer would examine the pulses, lentils, beans, chickpeas, piled high in baskets, feeling the dried grains. They would select fresh greens, cabbage, mallow, or lettuce, handling the cool, dewy leaves to check for freshness. The scent here is earthy and clean, a mix of fresh soil, wet stone, and the salty, sharp smell of the fish section, where fresh catch might be laid out, waiting to be quickly preserved or cooked. The transaction is quiet, concluding with the gentle clink of a few copper coins being dropped into a seller's pouch. The rhythm of the Roman calendar. The most significant constraint on the Roman cook was the unyielding agricultural calendar. There was no bypassing the seasons. The menu of the day was entirely dependent on what the fields and orchards had yielded. This natural rhythm lent a predictability and simplicity to the Roman diet that we have largely lost today. In the spring, the kitchen was filled with the freshness of new growth, delicate greens, asparagus, and the first fresh eggs. The cooking would be lighter, focusing on quick boiling and dressing with oil and vinegar. In the summer, the markets exploded with fruits, plums, apples, pears, and grapes. The cooking focused on dishes that could be prepared quickly to avoid the unbearable heat of the kitchen, or foods that could be enjoyed cool. The sounds are of quiet slicing and gentle arrangement on platters. The autumn brought the harvest of the staple grains and the vital olive pressing. This was the busiest time for the pantry, as grains were stored and vast quantities of oil were decanted into amphorae. The sounds of this season are heavy and resonant, the movement of large, full jars and the soft pouring sound of oil filling the terracotta vessels. And in the long, dark winter, the kitchen relied heavily on the preserved goods we discussed earlier, the dried pulses, brined vegetables, salted pork, and dried fruits. Winter cooking was a return to the slow, sustained heat of the focus, focusing on rich, long-simmered stews like the hearty menudo, the whisper of exotic imports. While the bulk of the food was local, the true mark of a sophisticated, wealthy kitchen was the presence of exotic imports, substances that traveled vast distances to reach the Roman plate. These were handled with reverence and extreme caution, often kept under lock and key by the cook himself. The most valuable of these was pepper, piper. Imported from India, it was incredibly costly, sometimes used as a form of currency. Unlike local herbs, which could be grabbed by the handful, pepper was measured out with scrupulous care. Imagine the cook opening a small, heavy box, the soft, dry creak of the wooden lid, and then carefully measuring a tiny amount of black peppercorns onto a clean, dry surface. The delicate, scattered rattle of these precious dark spheres as they are counted, one by one, before being placed into the mortarium. This is the sound of concentrated value, a quiet addition that would ultimately lend a powerful, sharp flavor note to the entire dish. The sourcing process is now complete. The seasonal goods, both simple and exotic, have been gathered. They sit on the preparation counter, cool and still, waiting for the patient hands of the cocos to begin the delicate work of cleaning, chopping, and transforming them into the day's Roman meal. The lifeblood, sourcing and preparing water. While Rome was famed for its magnificent aqueduct system, delivering water across the city, the Roman cook still treated water, or aqua, with respect and caution. For drinking and certain delicate culinary tasks, water was often brought to a boil. In the early morning, one of the first tasks was placing a large, clean olla full of water directly over a moderate flame. This wasn't a vigorous, turbulent action. It was a steady, sustained heating. The cook would listen for the subtle shift in sound, the initial low rumble, the gentle hiss of steam escaping the rim, and finally, the steady, rhythmic plop, plop, plop of a consistent, rolling boil. This bubbling sound was a soft assurance of cleanliness and safety. The boiled water would then be set aside to cool, often stored in large, stoppered earthenware jugs, ready to be used for cooking, mixing, or drinking throughout the day. The sound of cool water being poured from the narrow neck of a tall pitcher into a cup is a smooth, liquid sound, symbolizing refreshment and tranquility. The centerpiece of social drinking, the crater for the Romans, wine was rarely consumed neat. The standard practice was to mix wine with water, a process that was both a social custom and a necessity for moderation. This mixing took place in the crater, a large, wide-mouthed mixing bowl, usually made of beautiful bronze or silver for the wealthy, and placed centrally in the dining area or just outside the kitchen. The preparation of the evening's wine in the crater was a small, solemn ritual. The strong, undiluted wine was poured in first, followed by the water, which could be cooled with snow or ice brought down from the mountains and stored in deep pits. The two liquids met, and then the mixing began. The cook or a designated servant would use a long, slender ladle to slowly, deliberately stir the contents. The motion was circular and continuous, designed to thoroughly blend the ingredients without splashing. The resulting sound is a gentle, sustained swish, the quiet movement of liquid against the bronze sides of the wide bowl. This soft swishing would continue until the mixture was perfectly homogeneous, flavoring the drinks, mulsum and herbal infusions. The contents of the crater were often more complex than just wine and water. A particularly popular preparation was mulsum, a blend of wine and honey. To prepare mulsum, the thick golden honey was first gently warmed, sometimes in a small pan over a very low flame, just enough to make it flow easily. The sound of the thick, warm honey being drizzled into the cool wine water mixture is a soft, sweet sound, followed by the quiet, sustained swirl of the ladle working to dissolve the dense sweetness. This process was all about achieving the perfect balance, not too sweet, not too sharp, a gentle equilibrium. Beyond wine, the kitchen also prepared simple, functional drinks. Posca, a mixture of water and vinegar, was a simple, sour drink favored by soldiers and the lower classes for its refreshing properties. More complex were herbal infusions, or pitesana, a kind of barley water. These involved simply steeping herbs or softened grains in hot water, allowing the medicinal or soothing qualities to gently infuse. The sound of dry herbs being dropped into a steaming bowl is a minimal, soft sound, followed by the deep silence of steeping. The preparation of liquids was characterized by calmness and precision. Unlike the often vigorous action of chopping or frying, the making of drinks was about careful measurement and gentle mixing. The finished drinks, cool and balanced, provided the final, essential complement to the rich and complex food prepared by the cocos. The sound of final pouring and gentle stirring ensures the completion of the meal's preparation. The auditory palate of the culinary day. The Roman kitchen, despite being a place of intense labor, possessed a remarkably rhythmic and monotonous soundscape, a sonic environment perfectly conducive to deep rest. The sounds were largely repetitive, predictable, and non-jarring. The day began with the dry, scratching sound of the fire being kindled, followed by the low, powerful scraping of the stone pestle within the mortarium. This sound, the relentless crushing of herbs, nuts, and spices, was the bass note of the morning, a slow, steady pulse that required unthinking, sustained effort. As the heat rose, the sounds became wetter and softer. We hear the gentle, persistent bubbling of the pulse simmering in the clay olla, a quiet, comforting sound of simple sustenance being prepared. This is punctuated only by the soft scrape of the wooden spoon against the earthenware, preventing any sticky buildup. For the wealthy, the soft swish of the ladle in the wide, cool crater, mixing wine and water, was the sound of evening anticipation. The only sharp sounds were brief and purposeful, the quick, aggressive sizzle of oil when frying, or the gentle final clink of a bronze spoon being laid down after tasting a finished sauce. The final stage of cleaning brought back the wet, steady friction of sand and ash scrubbing the heavy bronze pans, a cleansing rhythmic sound that marked the end of the shift. All these sounds, taken together, formed a quiet, predictable daily auditory clock. The olfactory landscape, an evolving scent. If the sounds were rhythmic, the smells of the culina were complex and constantly evolving. The air itself was a palimpsest of layered odors, none of which were easily escaped. The foundational scent was always wood smoke and ash, a dry, earthy, comforting smell that clung to the walls and clothes. Layered on this, the most pervasive savory aroma was the pungent, deep, and salty odor of garum. This fish sauce was not a top note. It was the unseen foundation, always there, blending into everything, often mixing with the sour tang of vinegar and the richness of olive oil. As the day progressed, specific, temporary scents would take over. There was the sharp, immediate scent of fresh herbs as they were chopped and crushed, an intense green, almost medicinal burst. Then the richer, heavier smells of long-simmered meat and vegetable stews would fill the room, a warm, savory steam that promised deep flavor. Finally, the scents would often end on a sweet note, the rich, yeasty aroma of baking bread from the fornax, or the sickly sweet floral fragrance of warm honey being drizzled onto a pastry or into mulsum. By the time the kitchen was cleaned, only the faint, dry smell of ash and the ghost of these savory and sweet aromas would remain, signaling the quiet state of rest. The efficiency of slowness. Reflecting on these techniques, it becomes clear that Roman cooking prioritized flavor, longevity, and texture over speed. The slow grinding in the mortarium, the long, patient heat required for baking in the fornax, and the hours of simmering needed for pulls and complex sauces, all these enforced a deliberate, meditative pace. This inherent slowness was a form of ancient efficiency. By taking their time, the cooks ensured proper breakdown of tough ingredients, deep infusion of spices, and effective preservation of precious food. There was no instant gratification. There was only the steady, unhurried passage of time, measured by the quiet turning of the pestle, the soft bubbling of the pot, and the slow, deep breath of the fire. This methodical, unhurried cycle is the essence of the Roman kitchen. The enduring echoes of the kitchen. We have watched the Roman day unfold through the lens of the culina, moving from the slow, rhythmic grinding of the pestle to the intense, dry heat of the fornax, and finally settling into the wet, repetitive sounds of cleaning. The simplicity of their tools, the sturdy earthenware olla, the heavy stone mortarium, the ubiquitous bronze sardigo, speaks to an enduring practicality that forms the foundation of much of our modern culinary knowledge. Their methods, the reliance on slow reduction to concentrate flavors, the use of fat and salt for long-term preservation, and the mastery of open-fire heat management were not merely rudimentary. They were sophisticated, time-tested responses to the challenges of cooking without modern convenience. There's a deep, fundamental wisdom in the patience required to manage a fire pit for hours, or to grind spices by hand until they yield their full essence. The comfort of repetition, the greatest source of tranquility found within the Roman kitchen, and indeed within any pre-industrial life, is the comforting certainty of the cycle. Every day, the tasks were the same, defined by the slow turning of the seasons and the simple needs of the human body. The sourcing of fresh produce was dictated by the sun and the rain. The preparation was governed by the hard limits of the stone tools. The cooking was constrained by the speed of the flame, and the cleaning was a non-negotiable end to the day. This monotonous, predictable, and deeply rooted rhythm stands in quiet contrast to the rush of the modern world. The cook, the kokus, moved within this fixed framework with quiet authority, orchestrating a daily performance that demanded focus, not haste. The accumulated scents of wood smoke, savory garum, and sweet honey were not chaotic. They were the predictable markers of time, passing gently and deliberately. Every sound, the soft bubbling of the stew, the low thud of the loaf being tapped, the swishing of wine in the crater, was a repeated, familiar assurance that the world was ordered and sustenance was secured. The quiet promise of rest. Now, the light in the culina has entirely faded. The hearth is cold, its ashes banked and still. The bronze pans are hung, reflecting the faint ambient light outside the window with a dull, cool gleam. The floor is swept and the air is clean, carrying only the faintest memory of the spices that were crushed hours ago. The kitchen is completely silent. The heavy work of providing nourishment is finished, and the tools rest, prepared for the next dawn. The repetition has ceased. The cycle has reached its point of deepest repose. Allow the final lingering images of this ancient, unhurried world. The smooth, cool stone of the mortarium. The crimson glow of the embers slowly turning to ash. The quiet, empty expanse of the hearth, to settle deep within your mind. This long, detailed exploration of the constant, quiet work of the Roman kitchen has ended, fulfilling its purpose of guiding your thoughts away from the demands of the present. The kitchen sleeps. Now, you may sleep too. Good night. If this journey through the duller side of history helped you unwind and maybe even drift off, please let me know. First, hit that like button if you enjoyed this historical lullaby. Second, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future installments of history too boring to keep you awake. Finally, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below about which historical topic you find so mundane. It deserves to be our next sleepy video. Your suggestions will shape our journey into the world's most delightfully dull past.